Okay, very good morning. Here we are, morning post the vote, and hung Parliament is the title of the morning. Big surprise for the financial markets. As you've probably read in the press, the pound coming under some substantial pressure this morning. And this was probably not impossible as a scenario, but certainly something in which the market wasn't pricing. Looking at my charts here, you can see other assets are pretty unmoved, but let's just make the pound bigger because that's the one that people are focusing on this morning, and we're at session lows here as I'm speaking. Now you can see here a big gap down. I'm looking at sterling futures because this market shuts momentarily and reopens at 11 o'clock in the evening. But if I flick over to the spot price, you will see a completely different picture. This was the pound getting hit very quickly in a very short time frame upon the release of this, the exit poll. We talked about this in the build-up a lot. The accuracy of the exit poll tends to be within about 15 seats. As a seat projector, then this pretty much gets strong authority in terms of the market's belief in what the eventual outcome will be. And obviously the key critical number here was 326. That was the majority kind of borderline. The Tories obviously had slightly above that. The whole point was, could Conservatives add and have a stronger, more powerful majority in the Houses of Parliament in order to negotiate Brexit? And you got the complete opposite. 314, they had lost seats. Labour seen an incredible performance, way better than in 2015. And also, when you look at the pollsters on average, that we've been looking at in the last couple of days, on average they've been saying Conservatives have a fairly comfortable 7 percentage point lead. There was the more kind of new methodology using quite advanced mathematics to calculate YouGov's 1% difference all the way up to ICM, which were up about 12%. Well, YouGov have got it right on the money this time round. So there was a large divergence. The balance was more like 7%, but obviously this is completely against what on average that they were saying. So very sharp move to the downside, and this is what often happens when you're looking at price action, is when you start running through big handles like 128, the immediate kind of fast money move or the algo will push the price down to 127. Then we get a bit of a, almost a bit of a bounce on relief that as some of the first constituents started to come in, this was very much based around Newcastle and Sunderland. It actually started to show, particularly in some of the Sunderland areas, that the performance of the Conservatives had been underestimated in the exit poll. And actually a lot of the Tories at that point, sources were suggesting that don't want to put too much faith in the exit poll at that point. I think that was probably, as we know now, wishful thinking, because we know how accurate by history those exit polls have been. Then though, as more constituencies started to declare their results, this was really from midnight till about 2 o'clock, then the pound came under renewed pressure quite consistently. And this was because as the numbers started to come in, what we started to see, for one, was a much higher participation rate of younger people. Now looking at that by percentages, the 18 to 34 year old age group were 63% Labour, 27% Conservative. The one that I actually find most interesting is 35 to 54 year olds, which would typically be more leaning Conservative, actually was split right down the middle in terms of support. 55 year olds plus Labour 23%, Conservatives 59%. I think that's probably the least surprising of the three areas. So one, actually this ability that Jeremy Corbyn has had in the campaign trail, this social media presence, this more confident Corbyn, this debating at these live televised debates which Theresa May didn't do, this almost complacency of the Conservatives has played right into Jeremy Corbyn's hands. And irrespective, even listening to a lot of the areas declaring Labour victories last night, even though they were like, he doesn't have full party backing, they did say he managed to mobilise, if you like, the younger vote, not only to register, but to follow through and actually vote, which was absolutely critical. Labour's hopes really did depend on the younger voter actually coming into the polling booths and casting that vote, of which it appears that they have done. Hence, the stronger performance for Labour. The other thing that was really interesting here was about what happened to the UKIP vote. Now, if I go down to the actual election results, so at this point there's still 4 more to come in. The Tories are at 314. Now, what's been interesting here then, if we look at the breakdown of the seats, the Conservatives have essentially lost 12. Labour have gained 31. UKIP, though, 0. But 0 was expected. What was interesting and what has completely backfired for the Conservatives was this belief that the UKIP supporter would quite naturally move towards Conservative. And actually what has happened is that they've actually moved more equally amongst the 2 major parties, both Labour and Conservative. So that Brexit issue, the hard Brexit, strong and stable kind of party policy of campaigns from Theresa May really hasn't paid off in order to capture that voter. So now we go into where do we go to from here. And this all is about now, a hung parliament is suggestive that there's no one party that has enough seats in order to govern this country on their own. So, do we need to start moving now towards the forming of parties coming together in order to get enough seats to have a working majority? Now the Conservatives, we've just said, a few more seats to come in, they're at 314. Now if they get to 316, there's an interesting conversation that could happen and will likely happen with the DUP, which is the Democratic Unionist Party. Now they have 10 seats, they're up +2. So technically speaking, if the Conservatives get to 316 and they team up with the DUP, they get then 326, which is enough to have the majority. On the flip side, if you look at the other parties, the problem you have about a progressive alliance, which would be the combination of these other opposition parties, would be the Lib Dems have been quite clear. Tim Farron, in fact, overnight specified specifically that there would be no deal, no coalition. So the Nick Clegg-Cameron duo that you got previously is very unlikely to occur. That means then Labour without Lib Dem, who are carrying 12 seats, even technically speaking with the SNP, still wouldn't have enough seats in order to have a working majority. The SNP, they've had a bit of a disaster. They've lost 19 seats. If you go up to Scotland here, it's been a bit of a mix between losing out to both the Tories and the Conservatives. Even Lib Dems capturing a couple of seats as well in Scotland. Maybe this is a bit of voter fatigue in some extent. The fact that participation rates in Scotland were very low kind of reflects that argument. Okay, all of this then means that as a formality, what will happen this morning is that the party with the most seats, so this is the Conservatives, will get the first chance in order to form a coalition government. If they fail to do so, that will then move to Labour and so on and so forth. The critical question here is what happens to Theresa May. She pinned her whole campaign on getting a stronger mandate, i.e. a bigger majority. You know, when she called the election, people were talking about 150 type plus majority, when she had a slim majority of 17, and now she's lost that completely. So you would imagine that she has to go now, because if she stays, you would think that then from a Conservative point of view, your leader told you one thing, it hasn't followed through. You would think that confidence within that leadership would dissipate quite quickly over a period of time. Better for the party, from Theresa May's point of view, to step aside, put someone else in. Exactly kind of similar situation to when David Cameron resigned the morning after the EU referendum, because he called the referendum, therefore he must go. Theresa May said that she was going to get a strong majority. She hasn't. I think there's a strong possibility this morning she goes. She is giving a speech at 10 AM this morning. That could be the time of which when she resigns. Now, there has been a BBC journalist, a fairly notable one, who's tweeted this morning and said the PM has no intention to resign and is working to form a government based on being the largest party in seats and votes. Irrespective of that, I still think Theresa May, quite possibly, today might be her last day as Prime Minister. If that is the case, Theresa May, statistically, if she doesn't make it through the day, she'll be the shortest serving Prime Minister since Bonar Law. And you all remember Bonar Law, of course. I didn't. I had to look on Wikipedia, and you have to go back to 1922, actually, for when that last happened. The question mark then is, who leads the Conservative Party? Well, Boris Johnson is your next favourite if Theresa May goes, followed by Amber Rudd. Amber Rudd of Hastings and Rye had to have 3 recounts in order to hold on to her seat by a whisker earlier this morning. Okay, let's have a little look at market reaction then, because there are a couple of interesting things I want to share with you. And this certainly is one. What you're looking at here is a blue line and an orange line. Now, the blue line is the movement of the pound on the night of Brexit, and this is the movement actually on the day of what we've seen so far overnight. You can see here, proportionately, the Brexit was a far bigger move than what we've seen so far with this election. Looking here, this is that chart which I've shown numerous times in the run-up to the election. This is really the story, if you like, of the pound. And the EU referendum, we had a really sharp move to the downside. That was the biggest move we've ever seen in one day for the pound in a loss. What we've had here, though, is this move here in particular that I'm just highlighting. That was when Theresa May called the snap election. People thought, given the poll divergence, the Tories had about a 22 percentage point lead, that this would lead to a stronger mandate to negotiate Brexit, and therefore we rallied all the way up to 130. The polls started to converge. We then come off slightly, but we were still holding up around pretty elevated levels. Now we've gapped down, weakness so far today, and we're trading a sub 127 handle. I think that we take back today that entire up move that was seen on April 18th. That means a pushback in the futures at least to 125.85. I think there's a strong possibility if Theresa May does resign at 10 o'clock, we push even quickly below there to 125 and possibly even further below. Hung Parliament, the key thing that this means then overall is that the time it takes in order to have these conversations to form a government means that we're not dealing with the other issue at hand, which is obviously the big one, which is negotiation of Brexit. We were supposed to start formal talks with Europe in 2 weeks' time. Very unlikely that that timeline is going to be met. In fact, we could, hypothetically speaking, even go back to the voting booths and have another election in the coming weeks. So if that was the case, that obviously makes things very interesting, because if Labour have managed to mobilise this young vote into taking interest in politics, and if they can be a voice that can make a difference, if we did have another referendum, and if the young people turn up in size, as young people have shown are very pro-Remain rather than Leave, would Brexit even happen? Because on balance, it wasn't that far a tip towards to Leave, but if young people now decide to take interest, that could make a huge difference to the future of the entire thing. Don't forget, the process of triggering Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty is completely unprecedented, never done before. We could, hypothetically, Britain, go cap in hand to Europe and say, actually, we don't want to leave, and actually, it might never happen. I would say this is a little bit far-fetched at this point. It's a bit early days to be talking about that. Because the problem that you have with an aggressive alliance, of course, is that the Lib Dems have said about a second referendum. The SNP are very pro-Europe, but Labour have said they would follow through with Brexit. And democratically, obviously, it is Brexit that we've voted for. So a lot to play for here going forward. And the kind of summary is I would say, any political uncertainty translates into market price for the pound as a negative. And this is the most uncertain political situation that we could have asked for from this election. What the outcome will be, We'll probably find out, we'll have a little bit more clarity at the end of the day, because we'll know whether or not Theresa May survives the day. The press conference at 10 will be key. But then also, these conversations now will go first to the Conservatives, then Labour, and so forth, to try and form some sort of cohesive government, which could, in theory, then lead to another election in order to secure that mandate. One final thing just to leave you with was a chart that I did see. And this is talking about the inverse relationship between what we have had with a weaker pound tends to lift the FTSE. What I found here is a chart from the chaps at HSBC. This is looking at UK stocks with a negative correlation with cable. So potential beneficiaries of sterling weakness. So if you were looking at single stocks rather than FX, Hiscox, for example, they are seen as probably the most likely to benefit from the bigger move downward in the pound. GlaxoSmithKline, Diageo, AstraZeneca, these are all companies that you're probably very familiar with, because these are companies that make a lot of their money from international waters, if you like. And so they're going to get more bang for their buck, if you like, from foreign revenue streams. The negative correlation, then keep an eye on these stocks, would be my advice when the cash markets get underway. Okay, going to leave it at that. So, big surprise. Jeremy Corbyn, a phenomenal turnaround. He's managed to do something that no real politician has done before, and that is engage the youth. They've turned out in size. Even the middle-aged quartile also was drawn towards Labour. Okay, guys, going to leave it at that. Enjoy the session, and I'll speak to you later on. Thank you.